Good day, my name is Sherry, and today we will get to know one particular Czech author, one of the founders of modern literature, whose fascinating novels and stories focuses on themes such as power, punishment, and alienation. From his notable works, I chose one particular story that resembles the situation we are in right now, the pandemic. To start with, I have here lines from the Metamorphosis, a story written by Franz Kafka. I cannot make you understand. I cannot make anyone understand what is happening inside me. I cannot even explain it to myself. How about if I sleep a little bit longer and forget all this nonsense? I believe that these lines are very timely, especially for the first month of the implementation of lockdown, when we all felt the impact of the so-called quarantine. Now, let us get to know more about the story and the author. First, who is Franz Kafka? Franz Kafka is a famous modernist writer, considered to be one of the most important and influential writers of the 20th century. He was born in 1883 into a middle-class, German-speaking Jewish family in Prague, now known as Czech. He received his doctorate in law in 1906, but worked at an insurance company in order to support his parents. He developed an inferiority complex, partly due to his difficult relationship with his tyrannical father. He experienced lifelong guilt, anxiety, and lack of self-confidence because of these. He had very little time to devote to his writing, partly because of family tension, his parents getting older, and self-doubts. He contracted with tuberculosis in 1917 and was supported by his sister and parents. He also feared being perceived as both physically and mentally repulsive. He suffered from clinical depression, social anxiety, and several other illnesses triggered by stress. He died in 1924 from starvation and tuberculosis at the age of 41. Today, many use the term Kafkaesque to refer to his writing style, which is characterized by nightmarish themes, anything having to do with alienation, absurdity, anxiety, or isolation. The Metamorphosis is said to be one of his best works in literature that directly reflects many of the negative aspects of his personal life, both mentally and physically. Now, what is metamorphosis? In biology, it refers to the way that certain organisms develop, grow, and change form. So basically, it's change and transformation. Now, the Metamorphosis by Kafka is the longest story and one of his frequently analyzed works. It traces the months from Gregor Samsa's unique transformation to his death from dehydration and isolation. Now, let's get to know more about the literary piece. The literary piece is a fictional prose narrative organized in the novella format. Novella is a text longer, more complex than short stories, but not as long as a novel. The literary piece was written in 1912 and was first published in 1915. It is considered as a modernist text. It means it is a product of poetic imagination or surrealism. This literary piece is considered to be one of Kafka's masterpieces, which expresses the universal concerns and struggles of modernity, and it offers insights into the lives of assimilated Jews living at the turn of century. Now, let's get to know the characters of the story. First, we have Gregor Samsa. He is the major character, a traveling salesman, and transforms into a hideous insect. Next is Grit Samsa. The teenage sister cares for Gregor but comes to resent him. Next is Mr. Samsa. Domineering, bullying, and punishing father. And then Mrs. Samsa, fragile, loving, hysterical, and rejecting mom. We also have secondary characters. We have the charwoman, the office manager, the boarders, the maid, chief clerk, and the lodgers. The setting of the story takes place in the small apartment where Gregor lives with his family. Kafka chooses to tell this story using a third-person limited point of view. This allows the reader to build an understanding of Gregor's changes as he comes to understand them. Now, here is the overview of the plot. Salesman Gregor Samsa wakes up one morning to find himself an insect. Since Gregor's income supported Samsa's family, his transformation has a huge impact on his parents and sister. The family falls apart as they begin to see Gregor as a hindrance and want him to go away. In the end, he starved himself and dies, and his family was relieved. The story is divided into 3 chapters. Now let us try to see the 3 chapters of this story and find out how the transformation of Gregor affected his family. Part 1. Gregor Samsa wakes in his bed and discovers he has transformed into a giant bag. Wondering what has happened, he looks around his small room where everything appears normal. He sees the fabric samples that he uses in his job as a traveling salesman, a picture of a woman in furs that he tore out of a magazine and framed, and the rain dripping down outside his window. In this particular chapter, we begin to learn the details of Gregor's human life, and we get the first glimpses into his feeling of alienation from those around him. In part 2, Gregor wakes in evening. He sees that someone has put a bowl of milk and bread in the room. Though milk had been his favorite drink, he finds he cannot stand the taste anymore. He prefers rotten food now. Then he listens for his family, but the apartment is completely quiet. This question of how much Gregor's humanity remains dominates the second part of the story. As the members of the Samsa family adapt to the new situation with Gregor, each one appears to develop a different perception of how much humanity remains in him. Here, we could also associate the situation being experienced by those contracted with the virus, where the isolation has caused them to not enjoy the things they usually do. And then part 3. In the wake of Gregor's injury, which limits his mobility, the family takes pity on him and leaves the bedroom door open at night so Gregor can watch them. The father dozes in his chair while the mother sews lingerie for a boutique and Greets studies French and shorthand in hopes of moving up from her job as a sales clerk. The members of the Samsa family continue to struggle with their uncertainty regarding Gregor's humanity, all the way up to his death. In a show of kindness, they begin leaving the door to Gregor's room open in the evenings, providing Gregor with at least a little contact with them. So, these are the 3 parts of the story that talks about Gregor's alienation and transformation. Now, let us have the other elements of the story. We'll have the major themes. First is isolation. The piece explores the experience of the other through the insect. In the story, Gregor's isolation from his family and the world at large is one of the focus of this literary piece. Next is transformation. Putting aside the obviously bad transformation, the literary piece considers that Gregor's family members must adapt to life without Gregor's earnings, and their roles and minds must shift drastically. There are actually 3 transformations that happened in the story. First is with Gregor, his transformation to a man into an insect, from useful to useless. Next is Greet, from a girl to a woman who needed to work to adapt to the changes brought about by Gregor's transformation. And lastly, the Samsa family, from hopeless because of Gregor's transformation to hopeful because of his death. Third theme is existentialism. Kafka employs the ideas that humans are directly responsible for their own development through conscious act. Another element is the symbol. The central symbol of the literary piece is the insect. It is subjective fantasy that describes Gregor's self-loathing, uselessness, worthlessness, meaninglessness, awkwardness, and ugliness. There are also evident proofs of modernism in the text. First is the nature of plot. A man turns into a giant insect overnight with no explanation and much surprise on his part. The absurd nature of plot is common to modern literature. Next is the point of view. It was written in third-person limited point of view and was written entirely from Gregor's perspective. Although most modernist works were written in first person, this close perspective used in the story shows the emphasis modernism had on individuals' emotions and reactions to events. Now, the literary piece is very timely to this pandemic because the insect also symbolizes our fear of the unknown, our failure to communicate, or intolerance of outsiders. So it would be great to give some suggested activity or activities to our students. First is the warm-up activity. We can flash quotes from the story and let our students relate their quarantine or lockdown experiences. So here are examples of lines from the story. And then, for the pre-reading task, we could let them make a simple author infographic. Here, students will research information about the author of the story or short story Metamorphosis, and they need to include name, nationality, genre or movement, birth and death date, major works and themes, career, and significant life event or events, and create a simple author infographic. They can browse the internet and look for some examples of infographics as basis for designing their output. Their output will be evaluated using these rubrics. So it will be assessed for 2 parts, visual composition 50% and research 50%. They can present their output through paper or digital drawing. So that is the rubric. And then for the while reading activity, students will fill out the storyboard timeline to be able to visualize the plot of the story or sequence of events. You can write 2 to 3 sentences in each board for the summary of each event in the story. So, here is the timeline, storyboard timeline. So they can refer to the icons or pictures for the sentences of the summary of each event in the story. So we have for chapter 1, we have 2 storyboard, 1 and then 2. For chapter 2, we also have 2 storyboards. And then for chapter 3, we have 3 storyboards. So they will have to fill out chapter 3, storyboard 1, storyboard 2, and storyboard 3. So after accomplishing all these tasks, we could also give our students this project or output. It could be a digital poster or comic illustrations depicting Kafka's of this pandemic, since the pandemic is somehow related to the story. We could also give them some pandemic journals or vlogs or virtual interviews assignment highlighting the impact of social isolation, or they could give suggestions or ways to cope up with mental and social impact of isolation. Here are my references. Thank you for your time and for watching my presentation. Have a great day!